The day, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, or our second speaker really, which is Emily Stokes-Rees, who's a material anthropologist and a lecturer at Harvard University, and she's going to be talking to us about museums and globalization. So let's kick off with you, Emily.
Oops, I think it's okay. I just touched something in it. Thank you, Justin, and thank you so much, Alice, and the students and faculty at DCRIT for inviting me, and Emily especially for all of her legwork, which I'm sure was enormously time-consuming in getting all of us here and dealing with the logistics. I have to confess, this is intimidating for me. I am not a design person, nor am I a critic, though my husband might differ with me on that. I'm an anthropologist, and so come with a different approach. And in what I'm going to talk about today, whereas Nicholson gave us that beautiful, intimate journey with objects through his life, I'm going to sort of be giving us a bit of a whirlwind tour of just some of the general trends that I see going on in the museum world in this sort of new age of globalization, as much as it is new and isn't new. And my hope is that with the two students, Anne and Anna Marie, who will be speaking with me, that my hope is that some of the issues that I bring up will sort of mesh in with theirs. So that's where we'll go. No. There we go. So, as many scholars have pointed out, museums have long been tangled up in the processes that we refer to as globalization. They have been subject to changes wrought by the time-space compression of changing modes of travel and new communication technologies, and by changing finance and mediascapes. Museums have been partaking in these encounters through their participation in global systems of capitalism, colonialism, and in their role in the construction of master narratives of progress and the hierarchies of objects since their 18th century beginnings, and even stretching to their 15th and 16th century predecessors. Oh, there it is. The cabinets of curiosities, or theatra mundi, representations of the world in microcosm. As an apparatus of the nation state, however, we have over the past 20 years or so witnessed a profound shift in both the identity of museums and the context in which they operate in response to the ever-increasing pace of globalization. From public controversies, and there are countless I could use here, but I decided to start locally, with the Sensations exhibit in Brooklyn in 1999 to 2000 with artists like Damien Hirst, which caused quite a stir, to the Belatung Shipwreck exhibition, which is probably much less well known, which was a recently found collection of Chinese treasures that were refused because of their context of their retrieval, were refused by the Smithsonian and are currently on exhibit in Singapore instead. To new and fantastic buildings. Everywhere we can see a heightened role and renewed visibility of museums in society. New forms of production, distribution, and consumption are altering the context in which all kinds of cultural institutions function, prompting them to think about redefining their relevance. This cultural shift calls for leadership and vision to ensure not only economic survival, but also imaginative responses to new circumstances. At the same time, with recent economic crises and large-scale cutbacks to the arts, along with increasing challenges to the authority of museums from minority and indigenous groups, I think we need to consider how we think about the range of emergent museum practices, and to ask what the public role is of these institutions within an era of globalization. Such questions, I would argue, necessitate a global perspective, which is what I'm going to sort of aim to give here. Though please note that with a 30-minute time frame, this is going to be a whirlwind tour and skipping over a lot of well-known museums. So what do new museums look like? Not all of the developments I'm about to mention necessarily pull in the same directions, and not all are equally relevant to all museums, but all speak to possible transformations in challenges posed to and in responses made by museums today. First, the rapid social changes related to globalization have added to rising expectations that museums have a duty to provide civic and community spaces that serve as inspiring and safe meeting ground for visitors from all backgrounds. Are museums answering this call for social inclusive spaces? Well, one thing I would argue that we're seeing is a blurring of boundaries between museums and other public spaces. So we have places like the British Museum and the Great Court. There was a fairly recent study done in the British Museum which has shown that actually since the opening of the Great Court, there are many, many, many visitors and tourists who come to the British Museum, and this is the only place that they go. They don't venture out of this space into the galleries and exhibits adjoining. They come and they sort of circumnavigate the Great Court and visit the cafes and the shops, and that is the sum total of their visit. Te Papa in New Zealand, also a fairly new national museum, they've done some very interesting things with food in that they have this cafe that's pictured right here is actually in a thoroughfare between two exhibit galleries. It's not sort of set apart or down in the basement where many museum cafes go. It is right in the middle where you can sort of see one exhibit, have a coffee, and continue on to the next. And this is the National Museum of the American Indian in DC. And here, this is looking down from above. The exhibit galleries kind of go around this central court. And this was designed this way to be this gathering place. The last time I was there, it was being used as a crafts market with indigenous vendors selling the wares. They have fashion shows and theater performances and dances and powwows there all the time. It is almost constantly in use. So in these cases, the museum and its architecture and design are not just about the buildings and their contents, they're about communities of use. Visitors become part of the production. I would argue that these kinds of developments are not necessarily indicative of museums merging with corporate models or theme parks or shopping malls and other market-driven symbols of consumer culture that many might argue. At the same time, and at the risk of sounding like I'm contradicting myself, I think of the Guggenheim, this is the one here in New York City, and its various branches. Most recently trying to plant an outpost in Rio. And I also read recently that Taipei has actually agreed to pay for the vast majority of the costs to get their own Guggenheim branch. This is not just a corporation, but a multinational corporation. And it's about cashing in on name power in a global economy that thrives on brands. And indeed, branding has become increasingly important, promoting a particular kind of experience of the museum itself that one wants to export globally in response to the opening of markets, the mobility of people, goods and ideas, the rise of technology, and an increase in religious and ethnic nationalisms. All of these contribute to the new world order of operation for museums. Before museums, I would argue, globalization also points to a rediscovery of the local. Visitors, staff, collections, museum tools to reach out to larger and more diverse audiences, to act out their own local visions in a rapidly changing world. So in addition to developing inclusive community spaces, museums are also more focused on providing unique experiences. And here's where the time traveling enters. In a number of new national history museums, we can observe a trend which constructs the idea of the nation as this natural, inevitable entity that stretches far back into endless time, establishing a linear narrative through to the present and looking optimistically to the future. So I'm going to show just a few museums here. This is the Museum of Macau, which opened in 1999, to coincide with the turnover of Macau from the Portuguese colony to the Chinese. And it is built into the Monte Fortress in Macau, which was this sort of, it's not really a mountain, it's like a lump in the middle of the enclave. And it was a Portuguese fort, as I said, repurposed into a museum. And you enter sort of from ground level, and the perspective is odd here, but you go up this amazingly steep escalator with these wonderful painted walls of scenes from Macau's history. And when you get to the top, this is the Chinese side, you enter this hall where the dual narrative begins and your sort of time travel starts. And you're underground here, and you move as you go through, you sort of circle up through time from the darkness of the past to the brighter future and higher future of a post-Portuguese Macau. And as you go through, you actually end up coming out of this building on the top of this lump with views over Macau and that ability to make those connections. The second museum, this is the Canadian Museum of Civilization, which was completed in 1989 and was the design of the building. You may recognize echoes of the National Museum of American Indians. Same architect was Douglas Cardinal, an indigenous architect. And here the main sort of history is in what was originally called the History Hall. But this was very quickly, I think by the time it was sort of 1990, 1991, this was axed because it was actually decided there wasn't enough history to be able to call it a history hall. So it became the Canada Hall instead. And it is all on one floor, this vast, twisting, turning, largely disconnected episodes of Canada's history. Starts in Newfoundland in 1000 AD and ends in Victorian Ontario with Confederation, which is 1867. George MacDonald, the director at the time, was quoted as saying, "Visitors are invited to set aside the present and enter another time and place." And again, we see this notion of time travel as part of the desired museum experience. The exhibits have very few objects. They're mostly dioramas and reproductions. It's not meant to be a work of history, but as a catalyst for cultural and identity production. We're going to come back to this museum in a bit. This is the Hong Kong History Museum, which was opened in 2001. And interestingly, this was a design, much of the design was done by a Canadian design firm called Andre and Associates, as well as Lord Cultural, they keep changing their name, Cultural Services Consultants. And this was the same as the Canadian Museum of Civilization. So what you have going on inside here, as you'll see the photos along the bottom, looks very similar. And here again, the museum's design impacts the construction of a particular narrative for post-colonial Hong Kong. All along the way, as you go through this museum, carefully controlled and well signposted pathways guide visitors through the story. And the reconstructions of street scenes that you can see are literally part of the structure of the building. They're immovable, they are unchanging. There are very few opportunities to skip ahead, to choose your own path in the museum. The visitor must travel through time, the inevitable path set out by the museum. So objects and displays are important, but we also see a real awareness of human interaction with the building and the more external design of the narrative, where we fit into history. Finally, one I want to show you just for kind of an interesting, kind of different take. This is the Woodland Cultural Centre in Brantford, Ontario, which is effectively the National Museum of the Six Nations. And it was opened in the late 1970s, so actually in a way quite ahead of its time. And the museum director asked me in a 2001 interview, what does it mean to say a museum creates meaning? I've thought a lot about that question for a very long time. In these displays, you're time traveling again. You start off with the diorama of pre-colonial contact, and you move through the history of the Six Nations up to the present and a very beautiful contemporary art gallery. And the idea is that the design does not just present content, it's actually creating it. So this is what we see happening on the insides of many new museums in terms of narrative. And I think that we also see a shift away from traditional museum buildings as temples of culture in the vein of the British Museum and the Met, to architecture that speaks strongly to identity as well. This is the Museum of Scotland, which opened in 1998, leading up to the historic vote on devolution in the UK and the opening of Scotland's Parliament, though that building was far behind in being completed. It was designed by Benson and Forsyth, and really echoes, as you can see very clearly from looking at the building, this idea of Scotland's history and castles. The echoes to Edinburgh Castle, which is sort of just across the way, are really apparent. And so while the previous museums we just looked at, the design dictates your route, this museum on the inside, interestingly, is much more disorienting and much more fluid. In each gallery, visitors can look forward, and it's even hard to take photographs inside this building. But this is, I'm standing up on this level, and actually right beside me is this enormous steam engine, looking down into a gallery from a previous era. You can, at every point in the museum, you can look back and you can look forward in history, from gallery to gallery, and also out. In one of the galleries on religious history in Scotland, you can look out of a small sort of portal to Greyfriars Church, an important building in Scotland's history. You wind up, after moving up through to the 20th century, with a view from the rooftop garden over Arthur's Seat and the Firth of Forth and across to Edinburgh Castle. In the Museum of Scotland, the architecture is not subservient to the contents or narrative, rather acts as its protagonist. It's not just about the collections and the history, it's about creating an immersive cultural experience. And the building in many ways gives the collection an identity. Another example, here is the Saudi Arabian National Museum. This architectural approach drew inspiration from the local vernacular architectural tradition of simple adobe walls, restrained decoration. The curved west wall bends towards Mecca, and at sunset, that entire wall glows red. The visual effect being a canyon wall, a reminder of Riyadh's beginnings as a desert oasis. Also, interesting devices are sort of included to provide for human comfort in a place where temperatures are easily over 40 degrees Celsius during the day. Thick walls and small windows reduce heat gain. There are overhead trellises and lattice partitions to provide shade. There are fountains and pools, which help lift humidity and lower temperatures. And so the museum, while aiming to become an internationally known icon, is simultaneously a locally familiar and comforting place, what Charles Jenks has referred to as a postmodern museum of splendid contradiction. Now, finally, and these are the last couple of stops on our tour, I think this kind of identification with the nation holds particular urgency in states characterized by multiculturalism. I say that as a Canadian, with a Welsh mother who grew up in the US and a British father. Identity questions and multiculturalism and finding your place has been an important thing to me. Where risks of conflict and dislocation often necessitate some sort of grounding in a common history and identity. Located within this idea of a common identity is the concept of citizenship, which I've thought a lot about, which is linked to membership and status, as well as a sense of duty and civil rights within a nation. Museums as educational institutions possess the power to shape collective values and social understandings, and are increasingly being called upon to use their representations to expand the practice and experience of citizenship, where cross-cultural connections are key to civic identity and pride. In 1988, Richard Handler referred to multiculturalism as a row of ethnic restaurants on any North American city street. This is a happy, clappy, what's known as a triple S model of multiculturalism. That's steel bands, samosas, and saris, where differentiating tendencies prevail and artifacts are reduced to folklore and craft, rather than seen as an integral part of life. Today, I think we can observe a move, I hope and I think, towards cosmopolitanism, or what we might call a more post-multicultural model. Before, museums were very much about who does and does not belong, constructing an essentialized nation through the exclusion of others. But today, new global relationships have reconfigured many power structures, especially those marked by the increasing global prominence and the economic rise of post-colonial states like Singapore, Hong Kong, Canada, Australia, India, among many others. With challenges to colonial models, the dynamics have changed between the centers and the margins that have traditionally structured the exhibitionary world. And I think we're seeing a shift from a collections-based to an audience-driven institutions. This has become a necessity, both economically and socially. So we're back to the Canadian Museum of Civilization again, and I'm going to contrast two museums. In the Canadian Museum, the picture on the far left, this is the First Nations Hall. So this is they're isolated on the ground floor, Canada's Indigenous peoples. They're set apart. They're set apart both anthropologically, they're set apart physically from the rest of Canada's story in the museum. And they're on the ground floor. Now, George MacDonald argued that partly there was this necessity because that's where the very, very large structures needed to go because of the space required. But there was also the argument made that, this is the foundation of our society. This is the bedrock where it comes from. It's been controversial for many years, though it hasn't changed. Then what happens is on the second floor, you have rotating exhibits about Canada's immigrant communities. So some examples, a display of Filipino clothing, model of a Ukrainian church, and these rotate fairly frequently. So that's in the middle. That's kind of like the meat of Canada. What Canada is built on is the power and the contribution of the immigrant communities. And then, 2 floors away from the ground floor, you have the main representation of the national narrative, the History Hall. And interestingly, under new leadership in the last couple of years, there are a lot of changes happening in this museum. They've changed the name. Because it's what I grew up with, I have to call it the Canadian Museum of Civilization. It's now the Museum of Canadian History. They've changed the name. And they're also really trying to think about expanding the history, the Canada Hall, to actually make it a history hall, and adding a few more sort of important events from Canada's history. But this museum, I think, really leaves one asking, where do you fit? Which floor do you belong on? And so in contrast, this is the Peranakan Museum in Singapore, which is one branch of Singapore's network of national museums. In the Malay language, the term Peranakan means child of or born of, and refers to persons of mixed ethnicity in Singapore that have been the product of the many traders and cultural groups that have moved through that region. The Peranakans are characterized by a unique synthesis of Chinese, Malay, and European influences, highlighting the benefits of cross-cultural connections, hybridity, and dialogue. This fairly new museum, it opened in 2008, presents Peranakan culture as a hybrid that encompasses the heritage of all Singaporeans, aiding in the construction of what it means to be a citizen of Singapore. The histories of the objects and stories exhibited express, and I quote museum text here, celebrate the diverse cultural heritage, a legacy which all of us, Peranakan and non-Peranakan alike, can share and take pleasure in. These displays speak to us about how cultures interact and combine to produce something new. So it's about creating cultural links through material culture. And I point, the beaded slippers contain both Javanese and Chinese motifs with European beading techniques. Anyone who visits this museum can find a piece of themselves in every object, and that is the aim here. It's about inclusion rather than exclusion. And in this way, the museum becomes a place where everyone can belong and where all can experience the sense of cultural citizenship. So in conclusion, globalization presents a multitude of challenges and opportunities for museums. And I would argue that the community needs to grow and develop the lingua franca of global networking, exchanging and sharing language and policies which confront such issues as questions of ownership, international tourism, the tensions between worldwide museum brands, like the Guggenheim, versus localized museums, and of course, the growth of a truly global medium for exchange, the internet, which holds the great promise of transforming hidden collections into visible global assets. A museum's identity does not need to be expansionist, like the Guggenheim, but we do need to think globally and comparatively. Modes of exchange may change in other ways. In November of 2002, for example, the Tate Museum in London, the Whitney Museum in New York, and the Centre Pompidou announced the joint purchase of Five Angels for the Millennium, a video installation by Bob Viola. It was the first such cooperative effort between major museums from 3 different countries. The work will rotate each year between the 3 institutions, the partnership helping to alleviate their funding and space problems. Beyond practical considerations, the joint purchase poses far-reaching questions about the nature of museums, which traditionally have been defined by the permanence and uniqueness of their collections. Rotating collections turns museums into flexible places of cultural exchange. Though personally, I can't help wonder if visitors, who are often looking for the particular and the distinctive, might actually be disappointed to find the same blend of global taste across the world's art museums. None of these dilemmas can be solved any longer in a regional or national context alone. But I believe it is still relevant to ask, do nations need museums? And if they do, whose needs do they serve? No longer can a museum purport to solely serve the nation state and its citizens. In a way, all museums are henceforth universal, along the lines of the ones we know well, holding collections which, whether in their origins or audiences, transcend national boundaries. The challenge for these museums, in other words, is to offer a sense of continuity while simultaneously adapting to change. We also need to acknowledge the global complex of display-based phenomena that appear in our current exhibitionary landscape: biennials, triennials, mega museums, festivals of culture, world expositions, and all the myriad museums of science, history, anthropology, and art that coexist and compete at any moment. Through the reconceptualization of the museum in a global world, I would argue that a new approach to their study is necessary, one which extends its view beyond an assessment of a particular museum's success or failure to communicate its message and to exhibit well. This is where the critic in me sort of falls apart, to a wider-ranging study of museological practices and situations which bring to light issues of power and identity and heritage. We must create a new analytic framework based upon the forging of new connections between the different manifestations of museological activity. Finally, the study of global museums must not forget its history. It must attribute contemporary practice as understandable only within the context of the colonial legacy and modernity through which the history of exhibiting has emerged. And through an acknowledgement of that historical context, I argue that we are witnessing the formation of a new internationalism, the creation of new alliances, exchanges, and infrastructures that will continue to shape and reshape museums into the future. Yet, at the same time, the museum's place remains in its local context, however altered. The site-bound character of museums could be both an opportunity and an obstacle in renewing their relevance for the 21st century. I believe museums, more than any other institution, have the potential to create real and lasting understanding between nations and cultures. And for that reason, they're needed in their local environments more than ever. Museums at their best have the special ability to make us feel, wherever we come from, culturally at home in the global world. And this is where their strength will remain. Thank you.